Well, today, now that he's talked about all the countries surrounding Judah, now he's thinking, maybe I ought to talk about Jerusalem and the people in Judah. And he doesn't say a prophecy against Jerusalem. He says, the lesson is a prophecy about Jerusalem. But let's see, maybe he can get against in there somewhere. Let me see, just as a quick refresher, the Assyrian Empire, and that's who they're dealing with right now. You know, we're in around 713 BC, 9 years before the Assyrians had come down and taken Samaria, just really cleaned it up. So Judah's kind of out there by themselves now, defending the Jewish people, because the Assyrians, all that yellow stuff, is essentially becoming the Assyrian Empire. And I thought, you know, and since Isaiah likes to talk about the Babylonian Empire, which really doesn't exist at this point in time, but it's gonna exist. And I'm gonna show you a quick picture of what happens to the Babylonian Empire 125 years from now. Look at there, it's the same thing. Babylonians come in there and they clean the Assyrians' clocks, so to speak, and they just take over everything that they had. What they didn't have, the Assyrians didn't have, is they never really were able to take over Judah. But the Babylonians are going to work on that. They're going to take that on as a mission. Oh, okay. So, let's see. That's just for information there about what those countries look like. One thing I did want to point out too, just for background, give us a little perspective about what's going on, as I kind of laid this thing out here about kings of Judah and the prophets that were associated with them. And you probably can't read this, and don't worry about not being able to read it. If any of y'all want the slides later, I'd be happy to email you this whole package. There's no secrets in here. But you're in the time of Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah. Hezekiah is in blue, you know, and the blue ones are the good ones, the good kings of Judah. And there's got Hezekiah and we got Josiah up there later on, 100 years down the road, are good. But all the other kings are red. That means bad. They were bad kings, like Manasseh, you know, and then we got the prophets. I put in light green underneath there. And there's Isaiah's the prophet from Hezekiah. Jeremiah's the prophet down here at the end of the things before Judah's, you know, before the Babylonians come in and take it over. You notice there are any prophets under Manasseh. Wow. You know, Manasseh was a bad king. Just so bad. Really terrible. And you know, he's the one that actually, if you go out and look historically, he's the one who had Isaiah sawn in half, you know, when his time came to an end. So you can imagine why there are no prophets under Manasseh, because nobody wanted to be a prophet for a guy like that. But, you know, kind of gives you an idea. Looks like Isaiah's the big one under Hezekiah. Jeremiah is down near the end of Judah's time, for whatever that's worth. And that whole period across there is about 127 years across there, for whatever that's worth. This is just perspective stuff so that we can get into Isaiah 22, which is what our lesson is about. Okay. You know, I started it out with, "Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart." And no, I didn't know they were going to sing it today, but I thought, that is so great. You know, you would think Isaiah must have written that song. Or who did write it, or when did they write it? When was that song written? Do you know that song was written? It was a Gaelic tune from about 600 A.D., and it was a poem. And then in the early 1900s, there were some Christian gals put some words to it and made the "Be Thou My Vision" a hymn for us, and that was good. But I threw it out there only because the word vision gets tossed out in the first verse of Isaiah 22. It says, "A prophecy against the valley of vision." What is the valley of vision? Well, as it turns out, that's another name for Jerusalem. And you know, people have little nicknames for things, and I was thinking about some things like our state. Some people don't say California, they say the Golden State. The Golden State. If somebody throws out the Golden State, a lot of us know they're talking about California. And some of us are from other places and that doesn't there for a second. And the other, Los Angeles, the city of angels. You know the town because, not everybody knows what City of Angels means, but people in Los Angeles do. There, it was the Valley of Vision. That's Jerusalem. That clicked for them. So when Isaiah is talking about the Valley of Vision, people know what he's talking about. He's talking about Jerusalem. And he goes on in chapter 22. He says, what troubles you now that you have all gone up on the roofs, that your town's so full of commotion, your city is so full of tumult and revelry, your slain were not killed by the sword, nor did they die in battle. What is he talking about here? He says, all your leaders have fled together, they have been captured without using the bow. All you who were caught were taken prisoner together, having fled while the enemy was still far away. Well, Isaiah is a prophet, not a historian. And he's talking about what's going to happen when the Babylonians come in 125 years and take over Jerusalem. That's what he's talking about. And he's talking about some of this stuff, in that your town's so full of commotion. And he said, the people have all gone up on the roofs. Anybody been listening to the news this week? You hear about Tehran? The people are up on the roofs. Why? Because they want to see what's going on and the tumult and all the things that are going on up there. You get up there, you want to see. You want to see what's going on. And that's what the people in Jerusalem were doing. They wanted to see what was going on. I mean, Isaiah even said, well, maybe they went up there to pray too, Maybe. There's a lot of things they could be doing, but they clearly want to see what's going on. But keep in mind, this is prophecy about what's going to happen 125 years down the road. And it's people getting excited about what's going on. The Babylonians are on the doorstep. They're coming in. Something's going to happen to Jerusalem, and it's not going to be good, according to Isaiah. He says, all your leaders have fled, and the people are, I wrote a little note there, because I was reading David Guzik, a guy who writes commentaries on these, and he said people were curious about the coming calamity. That's what Jerusalem was concerned about. The Babylonians are going to come in, there will be calamity. So, it says, all your leaders have fled, and that is right. Everybody, when the Babylonians finally come in 125 years down the road, people know it's not going to do them any good to stand and fight. Well, let me put it this way. God would have liked them to stand and fight. He would have loved it if they did and had asked him for guidance about how to do it. But they didn't do that. They're not going there. They weren't there. So in Jeremiah, if you went over to Jeremiah chapter 38, now this is 125 years here, or about 100 years after Isaiah. And Jeremiah says, this is what the Lord says, whoever stays in the city will die by the sword, famine, or plague, but whoever goes over to the Babylonians will live. They will escape with their lives, they will live. And that's part of it there. The people, I think they chose life. They decided they wanted to live, but again, that's 100 and something years down the road from Isaiah. Well, let's go over to verse 4. Therefore I said, turn away from me, this is Isaiah, let me weep bitterly. Do not try to console me over the destruction of my people. Isaiah is concerned about this. He's sad, not just about what's going on right now with Assyria taking over, but what he sees coming in the future when the Babylonians come in. He is concerned about that. He's sad about it. The Lord Almighty has a day of tumult and trampling and terror in the Valley of Vision in Jerusalem. Okay, a day of battering down walls and of crying out to the mountains. Isaiah is sad. Yeah. Okay. So trouble is coming, and what there's kind of a theme through this whole chapter and probably through the whole book of Isaiah is that people, they're being confronted with really challenging situations, and they're finding all kinds of solutions to about how to address these things. But one solution that they don't have on their menu is relying on God to help them fix the problem. So it talks about, in verse 6, Elam takes up the quiver with her charioteers and horses. Remember, Elam is over on the Persian side of the Tigris and Euphrates, over there where, remember the desert and the sea that we talked about last week? That's the other side of the desert and sea. So Elam is a country over there on the other side, and they're always kind of like poking at the Assyrians and everything. So they're a little powerful themselves. Elam later gets absorbed by the Persians. Persians take it over, and all becomes Persia, especially when Cyrus the Great takes over. Long ways down the road, though, for that to happen. Okay, because the Israelis not only have to go through losing Jerusalem and everything when they're attacked by the Babylonians, then they got to go 70 years and be exiled over there. And then Cyrus, the Persian king, comes in and gives them a break. So let's see. He says, Elam takes up the quiver with her charioteers and horses. Kir uncovers the shield. And Kir is another place that's over there across the Tigris and Euphrates as well, in the Persian side of things. Back when the Assyrians were conquering all these countries like Damascus and Syria, they did like what a lot of these Persian countries did. You come in, you take over a country, and you don't want the people to revolt. So what you do is you exile them. You export them. You take them somewhere. And the people in Damascus, Syria, were exported to this place called Kir, K-I-R, up there. That's what Kir is about in here. I don't know that that's what it's about, but that's a fact that goes along with what it's talking about. But what Isaiah is saying, both of those countries are kind of like gearing up for battle. He says, your choicest valleys are full of chariots, and horsemen are posted at the city gates, meaning Jerusalem's gates. The Lord stripped away the defenses of Judah, and you looked in that day to the weapons in the palace of the forest. What? You know, we said the Valley of Vision is Jerusalem, so Palace of the Forest must mean something. What in the heck is that? Well, as it turns out, old King Solomon, a few hundred years earlier, built this armory and temple in Jerusalem, and he built it out of the cedars of Lebanon. And the people, when they looked at those things that Solomon built, they called it the Palace of the Forest, because it was built out of all the... Man, I can tell you, if I could build a house out of cedars, I would love the smell. And my homeowner's insurance policy would hate it, because the fire insurance guys, but it would smell really good. I love a chest of drawers or something like that. It's got cedars in it. Okay, let's see what he said. Okay, I think I've said all I want to say about that one. Plugging on, verse 9. Judah's preparations to withstand the Babylonian threat. Let's see. He said, you saw the walls of the city of David were broken through in many places. And this is Isaiah talking to the people. He's a prophet. But he said, you're getting ready to deal with these external threats, whether it's the Assyrians now or the Babylonians down the road. And you see all these things. Maybe we ought to fix them up and strengthen our defenses. And he said, let's fix the walls. Maybe we don't want these guys to surround us and cut off our water supply, so maybe we need to make sure we got water in there. You ever heard this term, Hezekiah's tunnel? King Hezekiah here, they put in that tunnel and created a line of water where they would always have water inside the city, even if they got surrounded by some foreign country. He said you stored up water in the lower pool. You counted the buildings in Jerusalem and tore down houses to strengthen the wall. That kind of thing about you counted the buildings in Jerusalem struck me as being kind of like you're taking inventory. You're taking a census. Remember King David did that one time? One time he did something, and instead of doing what God kind of led him to, he decided to go count all his warriors. And I kind of saw maybe this is something Isaiah is thinking about all this stuff. We got a bad track record here about we find other things to do, like let's do a census rather than turning to God and asking God to help us through this deal. If you turn to God, God might have said, hey, I think we can cut a deal with these guys. But you never know if you don't ask. And the people weren't asking God about anything. Let's see. Okay, you built a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool, but you did not look to the one who made it or have regard for the one who planned it long ago. Okay, and I think that's the bottom line on a lot of the little sections throughout Isaiah 22 is that, gosh, you're doing everything else but looking to God for an answer. Verse 12, the Lord Almighty called you on that day to weep and to wail, to tear out your hair and put on sackcloth. You know, that's kind of the Jewish thing, right? When you get misery, you put on the old dirty clothes, the sackcloth and and everything, and tearing out your hair. That sounds pretty tough, especially if you're one of those people who believe in growing your beard. Everything, people pulling that out, punishing yourself. It's almost like the flagellation term, that they used to use where people would beat themselves, and that went on and on. But he said, rather than expressing some kind of emotion to God about where you're at and how bad things are and that you need God's help, people weren't doing it. He says, but see. He said, you're not doing that. Instead, there's joy and revelry. You're up on the roofs. You're having a good time. Everything he says. But see, there's joy and revelry, slaughtering of cattle, killing of sheep, eating of meat, and drinking of wine. And he said, let us eat and drink. You say, for tomorrow we die. Wow, that's interesting. When he said, you say, he kind of implies that this is a common thing that people would eat and drink when they're confronted with bad situations. And there are some people that point back to the reason that they might think that is because back in Ecclesiastes, which was written about 300 years earlier under Solomon, there was something that kind of implied that, let us eat and drink and be merry. Now, Shakespeare, they're not copying Shakespeare here. Shakespeare copied them, about let us eat and drink, tomorrow we may die. But the point is that the fact that they were willing to eat and drink rather than get serious and figure out how to defend themselves, it was a fatalistic outlook. In other words, there's no hope in us getting anything done. We might as well just enjoy life. That was the bottom line. I did want to go back and look at where they might have gotten that saying from, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, which covers a lot of terrain, by the way, there's a time for everything, a season for everything, a time to live, a time to die, a time to have fun, time, whatever. There's a whole laundry list of things in Ecclesiastes 3. And a season for every activity under the heavens is kind of what it said. And then there's a laundry list in Ecclesiastes 3. And then starting in verse 11, it says, he has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. There's a Bob Vander Zag saying that he used to tell us all the time. God put eternity in every man's heart. Everybody knows that's an issue out there that they are going to have to deal with. A lot of people don't want to deal with it, just like the people here in Jerusalem. They don't want to deal with what they're being faced with. They'd rather, I'll worry about it later. I'll worry about eternity later. But in verse 12, it says, I know, and this is Ecclesiastes 3, verse 12, I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live. And Isaiah is thinking that the people in Jerusalem, out of all the things they pick, they go back and they look at that and they think, it's okay to eat, drink, and be merry because of that. How about that? Verse 14, Isaiah. Okay. The Lord Almighty has revealed this in my hearing. This is Isaiah saying, till your dying day, this sin will not be atoned for, says the Lord Almighty. So what sin is he talking about? And I couldn't even, I kind of lost track myself, so I put it up there in red. It's the sin of ignoring God. That is the sin that he's concerned about. People ignore God. They find other things to do other than asking God for help. And Isaiah is telling them, you're not going to be able to atone for having done that. Okay, probably need just a little, before I go into the next section here, I just wanted to throw a little history here. So in the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, remember he's in charge about 30 years, so it's about the middle of his reign, somewhere around 701 BC, the Assyrians have taken over, the northern kingdom in 722, and they're on the doorstep of coming into Judah. And when they do, you remember that old story about they come down and they talk they want to talk to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah sends a couple of guys out to meet with the leader of the Assyrian group, the field commander they call him, and the people he sends out are two people that we're going to hear about later on, and that's why I'm bringing this up. One of the guys was named Shebna, who is the secretary. He's kind of like the mayor, I guess, He's not the king. We still got Hezekiah, but he's a big wheel in town, the secretary Shebna, and the palace administrator's son, not the palace administrator, but the son of the palace administrator, and his name is Eliakim. We're going to hear more about these in a minute, so I'm just kind of setting the stage. But you remember in the story, and I don't want to steal somebody else's thunder, because eventually, maybe in chapter 36 or so, we will get down to this, what actually happens here. But the Assyrians want to come in, and they make some threats, and Isaiah tells them to kind of ignore these guys, and that God will help them. And you know what? When the Assyrians could have come in and wiped out Judah at that time, and instead, Isaiah tells Hezekiah just to ignore them, not to yield to what they were doing, and all of a sudden, 185,000 of these Assyrians die. They die. And that's in Kings. It's also in Isaiah chapter 36. We'll get that later. All I wanted to do is tell you about this guy, Shebna and Eliakim. They're the guys that Hezekiah sent out to talk to the Assyrians. Not necessarily successfully, but just to have the conversation and bring the word back to the king about what was going on. So, in verse 15, by the way, Isaiah didn't have that slide I just showed you there. He went right to this one. He said, this is what the Lord says. The Lord Almighty says, go say to this steward, to Shebna, the palace administrator, what are you doing here, and who gave you permission? I just thought that was kind of a leap. All of a sudden, we're talking about Shebna, and if you didn't know anything about the background on him, you might wonder, who is he? Well, he was kind of a big wheel. He was kind of like, he was on the staff, as we'd say, in commander terms here, right? He's on the staff, one of the guys on Hezekiah's staff, running Jerusalem. He says, what are you doing here? Who gave you permission to cut out a grave for yourself here, hewing your grave on the height and chiseling your resting place in the rock? So Shebna, when you're given all this responsibility and you're kind of like the big wheel in town, after a while, you kind of stand up straight, you get a little arrogant, and you become maybe a little proud of yourself and what you do. And I think Shebna must have gotten there, because somewhere along the line, he decided he would make a mausoleum for himself, a tomb, And I can tell you, this did not sit well with Isaiah. Isaiah thought we ought to be talking to God and probably paying attention to the king and doing what Hezekiah wants. And all of a sudden, the central point of contact in town is Shebna. And Isaiah doesn't like that. And he's pointing out here something that we haven't seen or given any background about him, about Shebna going out there and hewing a grave out for himself. Creating a monument to himself for after he dies. Okay, this is not in the Bible. This is just some amplifying information on Shebna. Shebna was in charge of the palace during the reign of Hezekiah. He's depicted as acting with excessive pride, building a luxurious royal-style tomb for himself in the rock while neglecting his duties. That is what would bother Isaiah most. is that, yeah, it's one thing to go out there and do something. You know, we're going to the movies tonight, or we're going to go out for a restaurant. But when you neglect other things, like, sorry, I went out for dinner last night and I didn't prepare the Isaiah 22 lesson, you probably would not forgive me for that, right? Okay, still got to do your duties, and I got a feeling Shebna was failing in a few places. Isaiah was instructed to confront Shebna, and that's what we just read out of the Bible. God told him, go confront this guy. Tell Shebna, you know, about that. That's what we just finished reading on that previous slide. Calling him, he says, confront Shebna, calling him a steward. And a steward. To me, that's not a bad word, but I think they just wanted to point out, hey, Shebna, you're not the king. You're a worker bee here. And questioning his right to build a monument for himself. So, in verse 17, now this is Isaiah talking for God to Shebna here. Beware, the Lord is about to take firm hold of you and hurl you away, you mighty man in your own eyes. Okay, he will roll you up tightly like a ball and throw you into a large country. There you will die, and there the chariots you were so proud of will become a disgrace to your master's house. I will depose you from your office, and you will be ousted from your position. Yeah, I can see, you know, even in the Army and the Air Force too, sometimes, you know, you rise up in rank, all of a sudden, you think you need a driver. You think you need other people to help you do all of your stuff. And I can just see Shebna, as he gets elevated and a little arrogant, he probably wants a lot of assistants that are working for him. But he says, I want to depose you from your office, and you'll be ousted from your position. But then Isaiah goes a little further. He says, in that day I will summon my servant Eliakim, son of Hilkiah. Hilkiah, there are many Hilkiahs throughout the Bible. You're going to hear that name pop up again and again, and it's not the same guy. It's like John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where, you know, we used to name all our kids that generation after generation. Well, Hilkiah was one of those names. And Hilkiah was a palace administrator too. And his son, he kind of drug his son Eliakim along. And Isaiah is saying, in that day, I will summon my servant Eliakim, or my servant Eliakim, son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with this means Shebna's robe, and fasten your sash around him, and hand your authority over to him. He will be a father to those who live in Jerusalem and to the people of Judah. I will place him on his shoulder. I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. Wow, he's going to make this guy very powerful. What is going on here? Who is this guy, Eliakim? Or what is it that Isaiah is trying to tell us here? And I think it's probably worth taking a quick look at Revelation chapter 3, verse 7, which says, and you know who they're talking about in Revelation? Christ, you know. These are the words of him who is holy and true. This is in Revelation. Who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut. And what he shuts, no one can open. I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. Going back to that thing, see those words? Same words that Isaiah was just talking about Eliakim. So we see it later talked about Christ. Here we're talking about Eliakim. You think maybe there's a little foreshadowing here going on about Eliakim being a foreshadowing of what Christ is going to be like? Maybe. Okay, going further, verse 23, he says, I will drive him like a peg into a firm place. He will become a seat of honor for the house of his father. All the glory of his family will hang on him. Its offspring and offshoots, all its lesser vessels, from the bowls to all the jars. Gosh, would anybody like to explain that? You know, back in those days, and even in Georgia, I can remember this, people would put pegs on the wall, and you'd hang the important things on pegs. You'd hang your hat, hang your coat, might even hang some bowls in the kitchen and things like that. On the pegs, the important things in your life, we're all hanging on pegs. Here he's saying the country too. He's hanging on a peg. He says, and it's going to be Eliakim. We'll drive him like a peg. He will become a seat of honor. Wow. He's really talking up Eliakim here. So the fact that Eliakim is a foreshadowing of Christ, I think makes a lot of sense. Shebna. God vowed to replace him with Eliakim, son of Hilkiah. This is just a summary. This occurred during a time of intense pressure from the Assyrian Empire. Yep, the Assyrians are out there knocking on the door. This story is a warning against pride and selfish ambition. Okay. Let's see, the human Eliakim, and I differentiate this, the human Eliakim as opposed to the foreshadowing Eliakim who's of Christ, okay, is only a temporary fix. And he doesn't replace relying on God. Because once Eliakim starts doing all these good things, you're liable to put him up on a pedestal, and then he'll be like Shebna after a while. He'll have his own drivers and secretaries and everybody. So what they were saying, it says, in that day, declares the Lord Almighty, the peg driven into the firm place will give way. It will be sheared off and will fall, and the load hanging on it will be cut down. The Lord has spoken. What he's saying there is, even though I'm giving you Eliakim, and that's better than Shebna, don't put all your reliance on him. You still need to rely on God. Okay? Amen. Oh, and if you think that these original thoughts from John Holland trying to figure out what Isaiah 22 is saying, I did see a couple of things from Charles Spurgeon, who kind of endorsed all this stuff here, and I discovered that later, but I give Spurgeon, he's a good man. I like things, but he talked about all these things. Spurgeon highlights the folly of Jerusalem, relying on their own defenses and wisdom rather than God. He warns that when men trust in themselves, they are ultimately vulnerable to ruin. And then he specifically talks about this Eliakim thing. And this is from Spurgeon, the nail. He wrote a sermon or something called The Nail in a Sure Place. And he uses Eliakim as a type of Jesus Christ. Eliakim replaced the prideful Shebna and held all the glory and burdens of his father's house. Okay, I think as I look at my watch, we need to keep moving on. So I won't read on that. Well, let's see what's coming up on the horizon here. Let's see, the spring equinox. The spring equinox is coming up in 3 weeks, right? A little less than 3 weeks. So what will that mean? It'll just be warmer when we come in here, I guess, okay? Something to look forward to. We have things to look forward to. And we continue next week into Isaiah chapter 23. So he talked about Jerusalem this week. He's talked about all the bad countries. Guess what? There are other bad countries in the minds of the people in Judah. Tyre was one of them. And we're going to talk about that next week. The music is coming. One day they led him up Calvary's mountain. One day they nailed him to die on the tree. Suffering anguish, despised and rejected. Bearing our sins, my Redeemer is He. Living, He loved me. Dying, He saved me. Buried, He carried my sins far away. Rising, He justified freely forever. One day He's coming. Oh, glorious day.